Hello, welcome to another episode of Arthritis and You, A Joint Journey. Today, we've got something special lined up, so buckle up because it's time for the deep dive. Let's give a warm welcome to our hosts, Arthur and Sarah.
Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're doing a deep dive in something that I know is super relevant to all of you listening, especially since you're already using low-dose methotrexate to manage your rheumatoid arthritis. We're going to be talking about those everyday medications that you might need at some point while you're on low-dose methotrexate, and whether those are safe to take together or if there are any potential interactions. Things like NSAIDs, right?
Yeah.
Or penicillins if you get an infection, or even just like the occasional antacid, things like that. And to do this deep dive, we're going to be unpacking a recent scientific review article that analyzed a pretty incredible 32 studies on low-dose methotrexate interactions.
Yeah, someone had to read through all that research, so you don't have to.
Exactly. 32 studies. That's a lot of data. So I'm really glad you're here to break it all down for us. But before we get into all the ins and outs of these interactions, let's make sure everyone's on the same page about low-dose methotrexate itself, or LDMTX is what you'll often see it shortened to.
Right. LDMTX, it's kind of a mouthful.
It is. Way easier to just say LDMTX. So this medication, it's a type of drug called a DMARD, which stands for disease-modifying anti-rheumatic drug. And it's often used as like the cornerstone of treatment for rheumatoid arthritis.
It really is. You hear that term anchor drug thrown around a lot, and that's really what LDMTX is for a lot of folks. It's the foundation of their treatment plan.
Exactly, because it helps to reduce inflammation and slow down the progression of your RA. And it's important to remember that we're talking about low doses here, which are generally considered safe and effective for RA, not the high doses of methotrexate that are sometimes used in cancer treatment.
Right. Very different situations.
Okay, so we've got this anchor drug, this LDMTX, working hard to manage your RA. So why is it so important to understand potential interactions with other medications?
Well, think of it this way. We want to make sure that your LDMTX can do its job without any interference from other medications you might be taking.
Makes sense. We don't want anything messing with our anchor drug.
Exactly. So to understand how these interactions could happen, we need to think about how your body processes LDMTX. Some of it binds to proteins in your blood, and some of it undergoes a few metabolic transformations. But the main thing to remember is that a lot of it is eliminated from your body through your kidneys.
Okay, so our kidneys are doing a lot of the heavy lifting here.
They are. And here's where it gets interesting, because your kidneys are also involved in eliminating a lot of other common medications from your body. And when you have multiple medications all being processed through the same pathway in your kidneys, well, there's potential for them to bump into each other, so to speak.
Like a traffic jam in your kidneys.
Exactly. And that's just one way that interactions can happen. The other thing to keep in mind is that LDMTX on its own already has a few known side effects.
Right. Like I know some people experience some GI issues or fatigue.
Yeah. Exactly. And while rarer, there are also some more serious potential side effects that we always need to be mindful of.
So we definitely don't want to be doing anything that might make those risks worse.
Exactly. And that's where understanding these potential interactions becomes super important.
So let's jump right into some specific medications that you might need to take at some point while you're on low-dose methotrexate. And I think a good place to start is with NSAIDs, because let's face it, almost everyone needs to reach for an ibuprofen or naproxen every now and then, right?
Oh, absolutely. NSAIDs are super common, especially for folks with RA who are dealing with pain and inflammation.
Exactly. So it's definitely important to understand how those might interact with your LDMTX. So from a scientific standpoint, how could these even interact in the body?
Well, one way is through that whole kidney pathway we were talking about earlier. Remember how we said your kidneys are responsible for eliminating a lot of medications from your system, including methotrexate?
Yeah, like a traffic jam in there?
Exactly. So both methotrexate and many NSAIDs, they get filtered out through the same pathway in your kidneys. And there's this thing called the organic anion transporter. It's basically like a little doorway in your kidneys that these medications have to pass through. And sometimes they sort of compete for space in that doorway.
Less room for the methotrexate to get out, which means it could build up in your system.
Exactly. Now, the other thing to think about is the effect on prostaglandins.
Prostaglandins.
Yeah, so prostaglandins are these chemicals in your body that are involved in inflammation and pain, and NSAIDs work by reducing prostaglandins.
Okay, makes sense.
But there's some thought that by reducing prostaglandins, NSAIDs might indirectly affect how your body processes methotrexate as well, although we need more research to say for sure.
Okay, interesting. So it sounds like there are a couple of ways that NSAIDs could potentially mess with our LDMTX levels.
Yeah.
But I've also heard about NSAID interactions being a much bigger deal when it comes to high-dose methotrexate.
Yeah.
Like what's used for cancer treatment? What's the story there?
You're right. With high-dose methotrexate, NSAE interactions are definitely more of a concern, and they can be quite serious. With high doses, you have to worry about things like bone marrow suppression, liver, or kidney damage. It's a whole different ballgame than low-dose methotrexate.
That's really good to know. And that's why I'm so glad we're doing this deep dive, because it's all about getting those specifics right. We're talking specifically about low-dose methotrexate here. So what did all those studies actually find? Were there any red flags when it came to low-dose methotrexate and NSAIDs?
Well, here's the good news. The review actually found that for most NSAIDs, there wasn't what we call a clinically significant interaction with low-dose methotrexate.
That's good. That's
But
important.
it basically means that in most cases, taking an NSAID alongside your LDMTX probably isn't going to cause any major problems.
Okay, that's a relief. But I have to ask, are there any exceptions? What about different types of NSAIDs?
You're one step ahead of me. Yes, there are always exceptions. One thing that did stand out in the research was high-dose aspirin.
High-dose aspirin.
Yeah, when people were taking higher doses of aspirin, it consistently showed an effect on how much methotrexate their bodies were getting rid of.
So it was making it more likely to build up in their systems.
Exactly.
Okay, so no giant daily aspirin regimen then. Got it.
Right. Always something to double check with your doctor, of course. But in general, that's probably a good rule of thumb.
What about if it's just like a low dose of aspirin, like those baby aspirins people take?
That's a great question. And unfortunately, we don't have a ton of research on low-dose aspirin specifically, meaning like 100 milligrams or less per day.
Okay.
But based on what we do know, a significant interaction isn't expected at those lower doses.
Okay, so more research is needed there.
Always. But for now, I'd say don't lose sleep over a low-dose aspirin.
Okay, so we've talked about high-dose aspirin, low-dose aspirin. What about all those other NSAIDs that people take? You said that for the most part, they didn't seem to cause problems with low-dose methotrexate.
Right. Most of the studies didn't find any major red flags, but, and this is important, everyone processes medications differently.
Right, of course.
What might be totally fine for one person to take could cause changes in methotrexate levels for someone else.
Because everyone's body handles things a little bit differently.
Exactly. It's like how some people can eat spicy food with no problem and others are reaching for the milk after one bite.
Yeah, that's a good analogy.
So even though the research is generally reassuring, I think it's always best to err on the side of caution, especially when you're first starting a new NSAID or if your doctor changes your dosage. It's always a good idea to get those methotrexate levels checked just to be safe.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's always better to be safe than sorry. So your morning ibuprofen is probably fine, but always double check with your doctor. Can't hurt to be extra careful. All right, so we've covered the wonderful world of NSAIDs. But what happens when you need to fight off an infection? Are penicillins safe to take alongside ZMTX? So we've talked about pain relievers.
Yeah.
What about when you need to fight off an infection? Are penicillins safe to take alongside LDMTX?
Good question, and something you definitely don't want to be hesitant about, right? You need an antibiotic. You need an antibiotic. Luckily, what we see in the research is pretty reassuring.
Okay.
Although I will say there aren't a ton of studies specifically focused on low-dose methotrexate and penicillin interactions.
Okay, but what we do have is positive.
Yes, exactly. One study that stood out looked at flucloxacillin, that's a type of penicillin, and it didn't cause any problems when taken alongside low-dose methotrexate.
That's good.
Yeah, it's reassuring, right? Now, there have been some PACE reports that have popped up over the years that suggested there might be an issue.
Okay.
But those mostly involved people who had other risk factors for methotrexate toxicity.
So other things going on that might have already made them more sensitive to the methotrexate.
Exactly. Things like being older or having kidney problems.
Okay, so harder to say whether it was really the penicillin that was the problem in those cases.
Exactly.
Okay, so it sounds like penicillins in general are looking less like a concern, which is good news for all of you out there.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to worry about avoiding antibiotics altogether if you get an infection. But again, always talk to your doctor, of course, because they know your full medical history and they can give you the best advice for your specific situation. Speaking of medications, we don't have a ton of research on what about PPIs, things like omeprazole or lansoprazole. What do we know about those and LDMTX?
Ah, yes. PPIs, the mystery guest of our show today.
Uh-huh.
Sadly, the research on PPIs and low-dose methotrexate interactions is very, very limited. We only found one relevant study in this entire review that we've been talking about.
Oh, one study that's not much to go on.
It's not a lot, is it? But this study did find that lansoprazole taken with naproxen and low-dose methotrexate, no problems.
So at least a little bit of good news there. What about other types of PPIs, though?
Yeah. So unfortunately for other PPIs, the research is just very, very limited at this point. There was one case report that mentioned some unusual side effects in someone taking a PPI and methotrexate, but this person also had another medical condition. So again, it makes it tricky to know if that's really relevant to everyone else's situation.
Okay, so it sounds like with PPIs, we're in kind of a question mark situation. Not enough evidence to raise any major alarm bells, but definitely something to keep on your radar and maybe chat with your doctor about.
I think that's a good way to put it, yeah.
Which really is the theme of this whole deep dive, hasn't it?
It has, and I think you've really hit the nail on the head.
Because this review gave us some really useful information and definitely some things to be aware of. But when it comes down to it, everyone is different, and everyone responds to low-dose methotrexate a little bit differently.
Exactly. What might be totally fine for one person to take could be a problem for someone else.
Exactly. So paying attention to how you feel, talking to your doctor, and getting regular blood work done are all super important.
Couldn't agree more.
Awesome. Well, this was a really interesting deep dive. I learned a lot. I hope you did too.
Me too.
So to wrap things up for you at home, the research suggests that most NSAIDs and penicillins are probably okay to take alongside low-dose methotrexate. But high-dose aspirin is one to be cautious about.
Brett?
And as for PPIs, well, more research is needed, but for now, talk to your doctor and stay informed. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive. We'll see you next time.
This has been another episode of Arthritis and You, A Joint Journey, brought to you by the Rheum team from albertarheumatology.com, your trusted evidence-based suite of resources available 24/7. Straight from Alberta, but for folks around the world. Our hosts today, Arthritis and Sarah Upis, technical producer, John Ifun, and our executive producer, Stephen Cates. While we work hard to maintain the accuracy of our information, we accept no legal responsibility for any errors or omissions. Remember, always check with your own physician first. Join us next time for another Deep Dive.